I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics. We're happy to have as our guest Jim Minner, well-known author and former executive editor and editor of the Atlanta newspapers. Welcome, Jim.
Well, Bob, I'm glad to be here. I remember when you were a great journalist. As a matter of fact, I claim responsibility for you being in politics because I'd been in two colleges, North Georgia College, University of Georgia School of Journalism with Sam Caldwell. And then I was in one army with him. That was American Army, the same regiment at Camp Rucker, Alabama. And Sam and I were well known to each other. As a matter of fact, when we were at North Georgia College, that newspaper was a cadet bugler, and we both ran for office, and I beat Sam by one vote. Sam had not perfected his political skills at that time. Anyway, Sam called me one day and says, I'm getting another job, and he was in the State Wildlife Commission, whatever that was called, Game and Fish Commission.
Right.
And he said, wouldn't you like to have my job? And I said, what does it pay? And it was about a $5 raise, maybe about $65 a week. And I said, well, Sam, let me think about it. And I thought about it. Then I told my friend Bob Short, I said, you might be interested in this. And you went on, is that a correct story?
That's true.
That's right.
As far as I know, yeah.
And then you had this distinguished political career, and I'm proud of you.
Well, thank you, Jim.
Thanks,
I'm proud
Sam.
of you also. You've not only been a great journalist, but you have been a great author. And I have read your books with great interest and with a smile on my face.
Well, my book didn't exactly make the New York Times bestseller list, but a few of my friends read it. It's like my friend Lewis Grizzard said, it's sort of a book of columns and so forth. It says, they make nice gifts because you don't have to read them.
Inman, Georgia.
Inman, Georgia. Inman, Georgia's in Fayette County. The tag number used to be 112, and before that it was less than that. And remember when they numbered the tags by the size of the county? Mm-hmm. But Inman, Georgia was a farming community. It had a railroad until 1938 when they took the railroad up because the business was not good. I remember my dad telling the story that they got a group of people from Fayette County to drive to Atlanta before court, judge. It was a hearing, some sort of a hearing. I don't remember if he knew exactly what it was, but anyway, he said it was two carloads that went up there for the hearing about not doing away with the railroad. And the presiding judge, whatever, listened to him say that, we just can't do this because we would have no way to get to Atlanta to the doctor. We'd have no way to go to shop and so forth. So this is our way to Atlanta. And Daddy said at that point the judge went down the list. Mr. Minner, how did you get here today? Well, I drove. How did you, Mr. Short, how did you come today? Well, I drove. And Daddy said he knew then that their protest was over. But Inman was a farming community. It had it had a gin house, and of course the railroad station, which incidentally I restored and have a little office there. And 2 or 3 stores. It was getting smaller by the time I grew up. But the main thing I remember about it was that it was sort of the roads, the way they ran, it really made sort of a square circle, if you know what I mean, a rectangle. Well, we lived here. I had an aunt live here. My grandmother here. Another aunt lived here. And I loved to eat, and they were great cooks. So, I would sort of go around and sniff, and if I smelled fried chicken, I'd stop here and eat. If I smelled something else down the road, but we ate well, and but of course I grew up in the Depression. There was no money. My dad had planned to come to the University of Georgia to be a county agent. He'd made one trip over here to scout the place out and so forth. But then his dad died. I think that was about 1929. And so he had to stay home and run the farm, 17 years old. And then all the Depression and so forth. And so he wound up losing our land for taxes and so forth. He was very proud that he didn't go bankrupt, as a lot of people did. But Bob, after he died, I was going through his desk, and I would see what he would do. He'd go to the bank in Fayetteville, and he would borrow $50 for a plow. A plow was one crop, you know. And I think he had about 13 families living with him. So he had borrowed $50 for each family to raise their crop on half of sharecroppers. And then when the bad times really hit, that little note that he borrowed $50 borrowed from the bank in Fayetteville would be sold to somebody in Atlanta. And then pretty soon it'd be sold to somebody in New York. You know, sort of like the crisis we're going through with the banks now in 208, but there was no money. I mean, there was no money at all. And I remember that, and I think it was about 1936 that my dad kept a ledger. And I was the only child. My mother was a school teacher, but she was not getting paid. And that year, our total cash expenditures, not counting fertilizer and clothes and all that stuff, was a total of $60. Most of that being for Prince Albert tobacco that my dad smoked. He smoked Prince Albert during the week and rolled his own and rolled Camel and smoked Camels on Sunday. But it was a great place to grow up. I mean, you knew everybody. The black family next door. My great treat on Sunday morning was to go out and eat Sunday breakfast with them. They had smoked link sausage, and I used to do that. And I remember that when I was growing up, we took the Atlanta Georgian. My grandmother Minna took the Atlanta Journal. My grandmother Harp took the Atlanta Constitution. Well, I read all three of the funnies, and Georgian had great funnies, but they went out of business. And but this tenant family that lived across the road with us had papered the house with the colored Georgia comics. And for several years, I guess, I would go out there and see my old comic friends on the wall out there from the Georgian that was extinct.
Tell us about your mother's family, the Harps.
Well, the Harps came in here behind the Indians. And as a matter of fact, we traced it back, and one of our Harp ancestors probably was an Indian agent. Very, very likely might have been married to an Indian woman, but because that went back before the Treaty of Warm Springs. But my mother's family, the Harps, have been in Fayette County since about 1820. My great grandfather's Harp, his name is on the cornerstone of the Fayette County Courthouse, which for many years was the oldest operating courthouse in Georgia. It's now a Chamber of Commerce building. But anyway, they've been there a long time, and they were sawmillers and farmers and so forth. And my Uncle Harry Harp was quite a character. He had a lot to do with. He was the one who went around the county signing up people for the REA. When the electric lights came through here, and he was Senator Russell's Fayette County campaign manager when Senator Russell ran for governor. And after this is a story my daddy told me, and after Russell was elected governor, you know, youngest in the state and so forth. Was that 1932?
32.
Yeah. But anyway, Dad said Uncle Harry was invited to go to Winder to sit on the rostrum, the podium, or whatever, when at Russell's speech, you know, it's a celebration of the victory. So Uncle Harry was a terrible driver, so he asked my dad, who was not related to him but married to my mother, to drive him to Winder. So Dad said he drove him over there, and on the way they stopped to get a Coca-Cola. And remember, in those days, at the little country stores, you'd sit on nail kegs. And Uncle Harry was drinking his Coca-Cola sitting on a nail keg, which had a little nail in it. And when he got up, it tore his pants, right in the seat of his pants. And Daddy said, well, Harry said, when you're up there on the podium with Senator Russell, said, just keep your feet on the floor and you'll be, nobody else will see. And according to my dad, that Russell was introducing his guest, and he said, now my great friend from Fayette County, Harry Harp. And he said Uncle Harry was smoking a Tampa cigar, so he put the cigar in his mouth and crossed his leg. And said, everybody giggled. It just showing his underwear. And I've always said that Uncle Harry got to be mayor of Fayetteville, and he was always into something, but I've always said if he hadn't tore his pants that time, he might have been elected to statewide office. But anyway, when I graduated from Fayette County High School, and of course I went through Fayette County High School during the World War II. At the time, we had 7.5 miles of paved road in Fayette County. It was Highway 52, ran from Jonesboro to Mr. Charlie Redwine's place of business. You know who Mr. Charlie was.
Mr. Charlie, yes. Yeah. Well, let's tell folks who he was.
Well, he was for many years president of the Senate, and when I think it was the year when Gene Talmadge ran against Senator George. Mm-hmm. That year, Mr. Charlie Redwine ran for governor and got beaten pretty badly. But anyway, he was very powerful in state politics. So he had the paved road came to his house and it stopped, and there were no other paved roads in the county. But anyway, I was saying that the Fayette County High School, because of no paved roads and and the train had been taken up, and I guess we had maybe you could ride the mail bus to Atlanta. But during World War II, we couldn't get any teachers because they didn't have any gas to come to Fayetteville. There was just no way to get there. So we had housewives, and my education was pretty skimpy, increased by the fact that when I got old enough to go to school, we lived about a mile from the bus stop, and my dad thought I was too scrawny to start school. I was only 5 years old. You know how it worked in those days. So my mother taught me at home my first year. So I only had 10 years of schooling when I graduated from high school. But what I'm getting around to, my Uncle Harry, who said he was a great friend of Senator Russell, drove down to our house right after I graduated from high school, and he said, I saw in the paper where that they were making appointments to the Naval Academy, and he said, I called Senator Russell, and he said, I can get you an appointment to the Naval Academy if you would like it. And I said, well, I appreciate it, but I don't believe I'd last very long up there. So I don't know whether I could have gotten whether Senator Russell would have given me to an appointment to the Naval Academy or not. But I know one thing: if he had, I would not have lasted long. So I went to North Georgia College, which was a great place.
And then transferred to the university.
Transferred here, and after 2 years and 1/4 at North Georgia College.
When did you decide to become a journalist?
Well, we had a great teacher in high school, Miss Frances Corey, who's been deceased about 2 years from Union Point, and she was she came to Fayetteville, and I guess when I was in right after the war, and she started a school paper called the Fayette High Times, and done on an old mimeograph machine, which was a mess, cutting those stencils and so forth. And she made me editor of that paper, and she told me that I ought to go to journalism school. So I said, well, I guess, I had no idea what to do, so I said, well, I'll go to journalism school. And my mother and daddy judged that the University of Georgia was both too large and too expensive. And I think the enrollment was approaching 6,000 with a big boost from the veterans coming home. So for some reason, I went to North Georgia College. For one reason, you got free uniforms, and you didn't have to buy clothes. And I remember my mother wrote the Dean of Admissions, Dean Will D. Young, a great man, North Georgia, and said, my son wants to study journalism. Can he learn journalism at North Georgia College? And Dean Young wrote back, said, "We are starting a Department of Journalism next year," which was an outright lie, you know. So I went to North Georgia to study journalism, and of course there was no journalism there. But after I beat Sam Caldwell for the editorship of the Cadet Bugler and served in that capacity for 1 quarter, I decided to transfer over here. And my mother and my daddy said, "No, we can't afford it. You just stay where you are." So I transferred myself and went home that Christmas and told them I transferred, which incidentally was the time that Dean Drury got shot. And I had to wait for a while to be in his course. But anyway, you know, North Georgia was a school of about 600. Over here was about 6,000. And I never had, you know, I was pretty naive, and got a room in Joe Brown Hall. And my 2 roommates were from New York State, and they were veterans of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. And they brought liquor to the room and women to the room and everything. and I was terrified. And so as soon as I could, I managed to get transferred out to a room with my friend Ray Jenkins from Camilla. And Ray was a journalism student, and he went on to be assistant to Jody Powell in the White House. He was on the staff of the Columbus Ledger when they won the Pulitzer with the Phoenix City investigation. And I've never believed it, but he wound up in H.L. Mencken's chair at the Baltimore Sun. And as editor there, Reg Murphy hired him. And so anyway, I've had a checkered career.
You were on the red and black here?
Oh yeah. And my one great experience is I transferred from Dahlonega over the Christmas holidays. And I was assigned, my ambition was to be a political writer, but at the Red and Black, they assigned me on the sports staff. And it came time for spring practice football, which I was to cover. And of course, I had never seen a college football game. Well, I had then. But you know, I'd never been anywhere, I didn't know anybody. So I introduced myself to Coach Butts, and then saw him a couple of times. And then Frank Leahy from Notre Dame was coming down to observe the Georgia practice and study Coach Butts' famous passing game. You know, Leahy was, I guess it, you know, touchdown Jesus and all that. He was next to God, at least, you know, at that time. And so I was assigned to go down and talk to Frank Leahy and get a story about him. I was terrified. So we're down in the stadium, and I'm sort of backed up in the hedge because I was really nervous, you know. And anyway, Coach Butts, who barely knew me, walked over to me and said, "Frank and I are going to watch this from the stands. Would you like to go up and sit with us?" And I did. But that was a great thing about Coach Butts. You know, he could be so nice, and you know, not many coaches would have done that to a little old scared kid, you know. But he was helping me out. But
who were some of your contemporaries on the red and black at that time?
Well, let's see. Of course, there was John Pennington, you know, who discovered, played a big role in Jimmy Carter's getting in the legislature and getting elected and so forth. John was our star. He had been on the Stars and Stripes in the Pacific, I believe. And then there was Mike Edwards, who went on to the National Geographic. And of course, there was my roommate Ray Jenkins was not on the red and black. He was the editor of the Pandora, which we thought was a pretty lowly job compared to being the red and black. And then my great friend Glenn Vaughn, who became the editor and publisher of the Columbus Ledger and Inquirer, and also with Claude Williams started the Athens Daily News here in Athens. But Glenn has a distinguished career. Then there was a guy named Dick Brooks who was a correspondent for Stars and Stripes in Korea, and made quite a name for himself over there. And of course, one of our stars was a guy named Dewey Benefield, who really never got in the newspaper business after he went through law school and wound up as a key player at Sea Island with the Jones family. And gosh, before me, there were people like Rema Tyson, and they just running out of the hills. It was a good bunch of folks that came along. They did well.
And you caught the eye of the Atlanta Journal.
Caught the eye of Dan McGill, who was the PR person for the Georgia Athletic Association. He worked through Guy Tiller, who was assistant to Ed Danforth, and arranged for me to be hired. And this was after I graduated from here in 1951. I was waiting to be called in the Army, and the deal was I'd go work there for the summer because I was going to be called in about September, and because of the rule, you had to get your job back if you were called in service. So I knew I'd have a job when I came back. So anyway, Dan got me that job. And pretty soon after I got there, Danforth called me in and says, "Son, you know what's the matter with you?" And I said, "No, sir, Mr. Danforth, what is it?" He said, "You're suffering from acute youth." He was right, but I've been cured.
You worked with some mighty good people. Ed Pope.
Ed Pope was my boss for a time, the greatest boss I've ever had. Bob Christian, who we didn't get along too well while we were working together, became great friends afterward, and he became a vice president for Eastern Airlines. Your friend Eddie Barker, well, he was on the other paper though, wasn't he?
Eddie was on the Journal.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But now, Eddie was writing a column for a while too, and after he got out of sports.
Syndicated column.
Yeah.
Syndicated.
And of course, Ed Miles, that was the great golf writer, and of course, Guy Tiller was probably the finest reporter I ever knew. And Guy liked to drink a little, and I remember when he died, I think there were more women that showed up in black than since Major John Pelham from the Confederate Army. And I think Tiller held the record until Lewis Grizzard died, which I hired Lewis 4 times.
You had a good relationship with Lewis.
Oh yeah, he was a wonderful person.
Great writer.
Great writer.
Big Georgia fan.
Great Georgia fan. But the thing about Lewis was he was probably had the best newspaper mind that I've ever known. I wouldn't say he was the best newspaper man I've ever known, but he had the best mind of how to get a story, what people wanted to read, and so forth. And he was offered the job as editor of a paper in, I think, North Carolina, maybe Greensboro somewhere. He was offered the job as editor of the Cox paper in Austin, Texas, which is a good-sized newspaper in the capital city in Texas. Good job. And then in one of his sabbaticals from the Atlanta Journal, Constitution, he went to Chicago, and he was about to be made managing editor of the Chicago Sun-Times, which he felt like he had to commit to being there a while. So he called and said that he didn't really want to be in Chicago, and so he came home to write the column, and which he had never done before. But I thought when I brought him back to Atlanta to write the column, that I had no idea I knew he would be okay. I didn't know he'd be great. But I thought we were really bringing him back for an editor's job, and I told him, I said, when he started writing the column and got sort of successful, I said, "Lewis, you can't do this forever. You do it for 10 years at the most. You'd have to do something else, or you just burn out." So in his last days, when I was visiting Lewis out at Emory Hospital every day, he was in his hospital bed and had his typewriter beside the bed, and because every day he was going to feel like resuming his column. You know, he wasn't going to be able to write one tomorrow. So I went by one day and he had his typewriter and he said, well, I think I'm going to be able to write one the next couple of days. He said, you know, you told me when I started this column that I could only do it about 10 years. I'd burn out and have to do something else. So I just wanted to remind you. It's been over 10 years and I'm still at it. I said, Lewis, that's amazing how you do it. He said, I got a secret. What's that, Lewis? He said, I remember a lot of things that never happened. He was the best.
Tell us about now ascending up the ladder into a big management position with at the time, both newspapers.
Well, I never really thought that I would go into management. I thought that I might be sports editor when Furman Fisher retired. Good thing I didn't count on that because he still had it. But I thought I would have about 10 years as writing the sports column after Furman retired, but that didn't work out. But anyway, I don't know exactly why that they decided to move me from sports to the Constitution, except really I do know we had a union movement at the Journal, and it was pretty tight, and of course the management was not in favor of the union. Well, the Journal Sports Department was unanimous against the union, and so they said, well, this guy must be pretty good, you know, let's take him to the Constitution, where they had a little in-house union that they wanted to get rid of. So I imagine that just between us, I was probably sent to the Constitution probably to bust the union, which was no trouble to do because it was not much of a union anyway. And just had to treat people a little better because the union, when they negotiated for a contract, because the Constitution had a union, they made sure that the Journal people got paid more than the union people. So all they had to do was just start paying them the same thing the non-union people were making. The union gone, you know. But anyway, it was a great experience. One thing sort of bad about it was that the editorial page where they carry who's who, you know. Well, it said Reg Murphy, editor. Well, under the way it worked, Reg Murphy was not really the editor. He was editor of the editorial page. Had no control over the over the newsroom, and so he answered to the publisher. I, the managing editor of the newspaper, answered to executive editor, who was Bill Fields, and by the way, the most underestimated, unappreciated journalist in the state of Georgia ever. And so I answered to him, and I had, the managing editor had nothing to do with the editorial page. The editor had nothing to do with the rest of the newspaper. But the public didn't know that. So, you know, the people were always calling Murphy wanting to do this and do that, and Murphy couldn't say, well, you know, I have nothing to do with that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Murphy and I became, well, at the time, bitter enemies, and didn't get along at all. And it was too bad because, you know, Reg went on to a great career, and if Reg and I had had the gumption and had the help from other people there to have formed an alliance, Reg brought a lot to the table. He knows how to deal with people, and he's a good salesman, which I'm not. And I think if Reg had stayed there, that maybe the Dayton takeover could have been fended off, and the history of the newspapers and even the history of the state of Georgia might be a lot different. But it didn't happen that way.
Let's talk for a minute about the newspapers. They finally merged, but the newspapers were owned by the Cox family.
Right.
Governor Cox of Ohio, who ran for president.
Ran for president with Franklin D. Roosevelt as his running mate. Right.
Yes, and his heirs have continued to run the newspaper.
Right.
What sort of political influence do they have with the management of that newspaper now?
I don't really know. I know this. While I was there, well, see, when I was first there, Jim Cox Jr., who was a good newspaper man, ran the Jack Tarver answered to him, and I only met him once. Ann Cox Chambers, who lives in Atlanta, who is listed as, I think she's officially as president of Atlanta newspapers or something. It's all legal corporate stuff. I never got a telephone call from her. The whole 40 years, the 10 years, the 20 years I was in management, I never got a call from her. She didn't recognize me if she met me at a somewhere, you know. So I got nothing from the family. And then Jim Cox Jr. died, and the funeral was in Dayton. I remember Tarver coming home from the funeral, stopped by my office, and he said, "Well, this is sort of the end of it." And he said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, you know, the two sisters who the governor Cox had left it so that the two sisters would have no say-so in the management of the company, all Jim. And then with Ann Cox's neighbor, the great lawyer, Buster Kilpatrick, they and some of the family, they decided to break the trust and will or whatever it is. But anyway, they wanted to take the newspapers over from their brother, who did have a drink now and then and fooled around with women and so forth, lived in Miami, and they wanted to declare him incompetent and take over. And Gene Patterson, who was then the executive editor of the Journal-Constitution, they tried to enlist him. Well, when they did, he instead went to Tarver and told him about the Palace Revolution. Tarver went to Jim Cox. They had a big meeting, and Tarver said he was there, and Jim and the sisters and so forth. And Tarver says, I said to the sisters, I said, "Girls, your brother knows more about newspapers drunk than y'all do sober." And now the brother's gone. And so Tarver says, "Well, I think I'm in trouble." And sure enough, then Barbara Anthony, who lived in Hawaii, her husband, Garner Anthony, was made took Jim Jr.'s place. And pretty soon Tarver was gone. I mean, he officially retired, but he didn't, you know, and then things changed. And now the Dayton people who had been subservient to the people in Atlanta, Tarver had been their boss. They were always jealous of Atlanta. You know, Dayton's really sort of a hayseed town, you know. But I remember we had a meeting at the Commerce Club, the editors and the Dayton people were down. The guy who was publisher of the Dayton paper at the time was with us. We had a big room there, and Tarver was a host. Waiter comes around for you to order drinks, and so stopped somebody over here, Derby McHale, said, "What do you have?" I said, "I'll have a scotch," and on the rocks, and get to the Dayton publisher, and he says, "I'd like a scotch too, but make mine Chevis Regal. I don't want the bar scotch." And the waiter said, "Sir, Chevis Regal is a bar scotch at the Commerce Club." But there was a lot of that, you know. And
let's talk for a minute about Tarver. As I recall, Tarver was a pretty heavy hitter in the Atlanta business.
Big time.
And political community.
Big time, yeah. Tarver was, he sat at the table with I don't guess mules sat at the table, but he shared the star of what they call the big mules, you know, the Mills Lane and Richard Rich and bank people and so forth. Tarver was really locked into state politics, and he was in the meeting. I remember he told me when the bankers and some of the money people invited Carl Sanders over to talk about running for lieutenant governor, and they met with him an hour and so talked with him, and after he left, they said, "Well, you know, this guy probably ought to be governor." So they called Carl and says, "No, you're not running for lieutenant governor, you're running for governor." So that's the way they played. And of course, Mr. Woodruff, you know, I never met Mr. Woodruff. He's the one person of my era that somehow I just never didn't know him. But it was Ivan Allen was a great one. He and Tarver were I guess they were the closest of anybody.
What happened when Tarver left?
Well, when Tarver left, they made Tom Wood, who incidentally, he and Dick Smith have gone into the community newspaper business, and probably the greatest newspaper story of the last decade, and they're just tremendously successful. They brought Tom in, but they didn't make him publish, they made him president. And then they moved Cox headquarters from Dayton to Atlanta, with Chuck Glover as head of Cox Enterprises. Well, they immediately wanted to start running the Atlanta papers, which they couldn't do when Tarver was there. I mean, they couldn't even touch them. And matter of fact, Tarver rode them pretty hard. So it's a little bit of get even here, you know. But what they could not understand about the Atlanta newspapers, that we had all these people over at the Capitol, and that we sent reporters and photographers out in the state, and that nobody was interested in politics. It was Doug. Of course, they wasn't interested in it. They knew nothing about Georgia politics. And of course, they'd grown up in Dayton, which Dayton is not a capital city. And there's a difference in a capital city newspaper and one that's not. So anyway, that's when they began to fiddle with the Atlanta newspapers. And when you would, where I did not ever get a call from Jim Cox Jr. I did get one, but I can't tell about it. It has to do with, might come out a little racist with it. But anyway, at my level, there was never any contact with the Cox family. There got to be a great deal of contact with the family through Garner Anthony, and nobody else but him. Mm-hmm. And because he had his ideas about what a newspaper ought to be and so forth, and didn't really understand that, for example, a Cox news release, he would say, you want to run it exactly as it delivered to you. That would have never happened in the old days. But anyway, so they began to the first thing they considered us all to be terribly racist. I mean, we were just Southern racist, and then they considered your readers wanted to read about Hollywood stars and music and entertainment, not politics. So that's when the papers began to change. But at the end of the Tarver Wood regime, when I was there, the Journal and Constitution grew to the largest newspaper in the South, exceeding the Miami Herald, and our after-tax, our pre-tax revenues were tremendous, around $20 million a year, and now I think they're about zero. Of course, a lot of that has to do with the internet, but it's like one of my newspaper friends in Nashville said recently, you know, a newspaper can survive the internet, and it can survive bad management, but it can't survive both at the same time. And I think that's what's got it, man. Terrible management, which is surprising to me because Jim Kennedy, the grandson, is a great fellow, and I don't know why this has happened, but Jim is he's in the tradition of his grandfather and his uncle. But Cox Enterprises is making tons of money. At least it was until the current crisis. But I think it's obvious to everybody that the newspapers have changed a great deal, and it's not all due to the internet.
There's been a public perception over the years that the Constitution is a very liberal newspaper, and the Journal is a very conservative newspaper. Was that by design?
By design, yeah. And of course, in many ways, if you look back, the Constitution has never been as liberal as it was said to be, and the Journal has never been as conservative as it was thought to be. But yeah, you know, you had to have a liberal editor for the Constitution. We didn't necessarily have to have one as liberal as Tom Teepin, or whoever they've got now. But I guess we're talking about Cynthia Tucker, who is editor of the editorial page, and of course has no influence over the news gathering operation. But yeah, it's picked that way, and of course McAllister, who was the journal editor, was picked to be because he was not especially a liberal, but it certainly was not conservative. But it's sort of a phony house arrangement.
When did the Atlanta Journal-Constitution change from the days when Marvin Griffith called them those lying Atlanta newspapers?
I don't know. It's not been too long because when I was there was still a lot of, you still heard that from time to time. And I remember, Bob, when we were going to South Georgia to cover sports, you used to have those staff cards with the name Journal-Constitution on them. I didn't care too much about going to Haywire one of those cars, did you?
No, I really didn't. I really didn't.
But the strange thing is, my son, who works there now, said that he was covering something, a road race in Atlanta last week, and said one of his colleagues was as a photographer, not necessarily from around here. Rick said he was surprised to hear the photographer complain that, gee, it's getting hard to interview people because people don't like us because the paper's so liberal, Well, that's not new.
Yeah. Let's talk for a minute about covering the Capitol. Did you have an overall plan of how you would cover politics and the state capitol?
Oh yes, of course, first we had a political editor who was really about the in-house, about the third-ranking person on the paper. Bill Shipp was a political editor. My friend Howard Raines, who is another story. Charlie Pugh, remember him?
Charlie Pugh.
And they were the chief political writers and wrote a column. And then you had people assigned to the House, several of them, people assigned to the Senate, the governor's office. And I guess even when we had a very small staff, back in the 70s and early 80s, what we probably had, maybe the two papers probably had maybe as many as 15 people every day over there, plus covering the state courts and so forth and everything. Mm-hmm. And maybe we did overcover a little, but a successful paper that makes money and has circulation, there's also this thing called power. It's got to have a stick. The Dayton people didn't understand that you've got to have a stick. And for example, when I was editor of the Constitution, of the Journal-Constitution, I wasn't into great shakes, but I had that job. And if I wanted to call the governor, he'd pick up the phone. They tell me that doesn't happen now. And but they pay attention. I remember when George Busby and Tom Moreland made the deal with the feds to get a lot of extra money that was laying around for the highway program. He comes over, he wants a meeting with editorial boards. He comes over and he wants to, before he does that, he wants to explain what he's doing, get you on his side. They don't do that anymore. But gosh, it was the newspaper was a powerful influence at one time. I've always said, the governors come and go, but the newspaper stays. Well, probably not staying anymore, but it was all, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution was almost a third branch of government. Mm-hmm. And another thing, the other papers pretty much followed their lead on a lot. Not totally, but particularly on news coverage and so forth. They dominated, and had great statewide circulation. Remember the Journal Predate? The Journal Predate was like today's Journal. Came out noon, and then we would go in the composing room and change a little and chip off the date lines and send it to people in South Georgia. It was a morning paper, mm-hmm. and they had a circulation of 40,000. And then our accountants, who didn't understand what they were doing, said, look, let's get rid of this paper, and we'll resell those 40,000 in the Atlanta area. It'll be cheaper, it'll be more attractive to our advertisers, and we'll have more circulation and have more money. And so in one day, we lopped off 40,000 newspapers. The Journal predate. You know what that was, Bob? That was the third largest newspaper in Georgia.
Gee whiz.
And our geniuses in the circulation department and the business department had no success in getting those papers resold in the Atlanta area. So it's, but when we began pulling out of the state, I think the papers just lost a lot of their clout and changed a lot of things.
Let me ask you this question, speaking of this big stick and power. How did you decide which political candidates you would endorse?
Well, I really never played much of a part in that. The editorial board, of course, the Journal had one, and the Constitution had another. Presided over by the editorial page editor. And at that time, I think they included the cartoonist and 2 or 3 other writers. Well, they were free to decide that by themselves. I'm sure they might talk to Tarver a lot and say how he was leaning, but only one time did Jim Cox ever mandate that somebody be endorsed. He ordered his newspapers to endorse Richard Nixon over McGovern. Yeah, and that's when our friend Greg Favre resigned in protest in West Palm Beach. But the Journal and Constitution both endorsed Nixon. But that's the only time, to my knowledge, that the ownership ever played any role in an endorsement, other than you know who the ownership is and why you're working here and so forth. And I guess that has some influence. Actually the Cox operation was a great one, I thought, and very open and let people do their job.
Mm-hmm. Do you think those endorsements are effective?
Not anymore. I think they might be. Effective if to endorse the school superintendent of Rabun County or something like. I mean, your county, but well, not that. That's wrong. But I'd say one of the minor offices in Fulton County, DeKalb County, where people don't know, they might just pick it up and read it. But as far as persuading anybody, they may even hurt.
What was the role of the Atlanta newspapers in the civil rights movement?
I'd say it was a large role, and not particularly in the civil rights movement, but it was a large role in making Atlanta sort of an oasis of keeping the violence out of Atlanta. That's what it did. It was very. I think the main interest, truthfully, was protecting Atlanta, because I'm not sure that those like Tarver and Ivan Allen at that time, and Mr. Woodruff and all those people. I don't think they were great liberals. I don't think they were on the cutting edge of change. But I think they were. I think it was pretty much a protective thing. They wanted to keep business in Atlanta safe and moving ahead, and they did. But Ralph McGill and Gene Patterson, they were and their relationship with Dr. King, they played quite a role. Got a lot of criticism. Tarver did for not covering the Selma March, and of course that led to a lot of trouble in the future, and Gene Patterson in particular was very critical of it. He was because Tarver told him he'd rather than not go. Well, they just should have gone. One thing about Tarver, I was at home in Inman one day putting up pasture fence, and Tarver liked for it to work 7 days a week, but I had Saturday off after working Friday night. But I'm about 8 o'clock. I got a call from Tarver Saturday morning. He says, be at the paper at 10. Says Jimmy Carter's coming by. And of course Carter was running for governor. So we could all go up there 10 o'clock and meet Carter, who's all by himself. Go down and sit down in the library, and Bill Shipp is there, and Shipp's got his tape recorder, and Murphy is there. Murphy won't speak to Carter, you know, he's Murphy's. And of course, Tarver didn't like Carter either. So we go in and sit down, and Carter essentially says this, says, look, you know, says, I'm running for president, as you know. Got a lot of things going for me. He said, I can win this election. He said, there's one thing that I desperately need. He said, I need somebody from my hometown newspaper covering my campaign. He says, if the Journal-Constitution would put somebody on the road with me, it'll wrap this thing up. I could be president and so forth. And of course, he's a next door neighbor of Ann Cox Chambers, you know, had been when he was governor, and she was his principal financial backer. And so, but that didn't faze Tarver. So Tarver turned around and says, well, Governor says, tell you something, says, I don't think you've got a chance to win. Said, but if that changes, said, and if I see where I think you're a real candidate, said, I'll put somebody on the road. And said, meanwhile, we're just not going to do it. And you know Carter, you know that look he gets, you know. I knew then we were about to be up the creek, you know. So anyway, also at that meeting, Carter was talking about some issues, and Shipp turns on his plate to Carter and said, well, Governor, you said this then, and then you said this then. How do you explain the difference when you know, it was an awful, awful meeting. I mean, it was embarrassing. And so at the time, we had a rule that you had to get Mr. Field's permission to send a report out of state. But, you know, but Carter was, the next week, he was going to Chattanooga. I talked to Jody Powell. And so I was feeling sorry for the little son of a gun, really, you know. So I called in Rex Grantham, and I said, Rex, go up to Chattanooga, it's just across the border. I glide out of that, you know, and cover Carter's speech up there. So he went to Chattanooga and covered the speech, came back, wrote the story. And I was waiting for Tarver to come down on me. It never happened. Rex Grantham stayed with him for the rest of the campaign, and Tarver never said a word. That's the way he was. If he knew he was wrong, he would not admit it, but he just wouldn't say anything about it. But so that's how we got how Carter got somebody from the Journal-Constitution to cover his campaign.
Jim, if you will, let's talk for a minute about some of your prize pupils. You mentioned Howell Raines.
Well, that's an interesting story, at least to me. We had a TV editor named Paul Jones and a movie editor. Paul was a character. But in those days, we didn't have the TV guidebook. And the TV editor, who was also the movie editor, had to call the station every day and find out what was going to be on that night and so forth and everything. Well, Paul was not very good at details. Complicated by the fact that Jack Tarver was a great TV addict. So every morning, Tarver would come in just raising hell about the TV clock that Paul had gotten wrong. So we had a guy named Dick Green, he'd been working in Alabama, an old friend of mine. He walked in one day, and Dick was a state editor, and he says, I know how you can get that TV clock fixed and get Tarver off your back. And I said, for God's sakes, tell me how. He said, there's a TV movie editor in Birmingham that I worked with in Tuscaloosa named Howell Raines. Said he's a smart boy, he'll fix it for you. So I called Howell Raines, asked him to come over to be interviewed, and he came on the 4th of July, which the newspapers closed down. So I picked Howell up at the airport, drove into the office. We had a long talk, and as soon as I found out that he was not going to be a union organizer, we started talking about a job. And I said, Howell, I said, what's standard question? What's your big ambition in this business? He says, I want to be the nation's premier gossip writer. I said, I want to do Hollywood stuff and so forth. I said, well, that's fine. In the meantime, would you be they're talking about being political editor. So I was still, you know, I had entirely made up my mind. Then he asked a question that really wrapped it up for me. He says, if I come to Atlanta, do you know where I can keep my bird dog? And I said, well, man, you're one of us. So I hired him. And we had a great relationship. And when our friend Hal Gulliver was leaving the paper, I took Hal to lunch at the Ritz-Carlton downtown. And that's so many years ago. And I offered him, at the time, Howard was, I think he was a bureau chief of the New York Times in Atlanta. And I was trying to persuade him to be editorial page editor of the Constitution. And he said, well, you know, I appreciate it, but he said, I've got a good crack at being editor of the New York Times. I said, Howell, I'm sure you do. The bird in that bush is a pretty good ways off. He said, I really think I've got a crack at it. He said, I'm going to go for it. And so anyway, some years later when he got the job, I sent him a note and I said, you know, Babe Ruth called his shot and you called yours. But he was, Howell Raines, my second best hire. I put Lewis first, Howell second. But he was quite good. And it's too bad what happened to him at the New York Times.
You mentioned Reg Murphy.
Yeah, Reg, you know, as it turned out, Reg was fortunate to get kidnapped because.
I was going to ask you about that. That's a great story. Tell us that story.
Can we pause before we tell the story?
Well, the Reg Murphy kidnapping, which you know a little about, Bob. But anyway, it was during when Patty Hearst was kidnapped. You know, one afternoon, a special agent in charge of the FBI from Atlanta came by the office and wanted to meet confidentially with Murphy and me. And he says that we have arranged to recover Patty Hearst, that she's going to be picked up. We can pick her up at the Atlanta airport tomorrow night. But first, we've got to have a classified ad in the paper to notify the people we're dealing with. And it's got to say, Pat is okay in capital letters. And it can't be anything else but that. And so you can't tell anybody about it. So of course he left and we told Tarver. And it was agreed that we put the ad in the classified section. And it was agreed that I would stay throughout the evening to see that nothing was changed. And it came out, Pat is okay. Exactly like the FBI agent happened. So the ad ran and we expected the FBI to recover Patty Hearst. It never happened. We never heard any more from them. So that was out there, you know. And then about a week later, we were having our 9 o'clock news conference in my office. I'm then managing at the Constitution, Reg, editorial page editor. I get a call from Murphy. He says, Reg, I get a call from Murphy, and he says, I've been kidnapped. I said, well, Reg, you're in a hell of a fix, because nobody would pay a ransom for you. And he screamed. He says, but I'm in the trunk of somebody's car. And then this voice comes on and says, we'll be in touch. And so people at the conference said, well, what was that about? I said, I think Murphy and Gulliver out drinking again. and so then they left. And George Tysinger was our copy desk chief. Baldy was our cartoonist. Well, Baldy was a great cartoonist, but he couldn't spell. And he always had something wrong with his cartoon. So I said, walked out and I said, George, I said, call Murphy's house and just be sure it's there. And said if Virginia answers, just don't alarm her. Just tell them that tell her that you will try to get in touch with them about the nightly correction to the Baldy cartoon. So George called, and Virginia, Reg's wife, said, I'm concerned. He left with a man about some heating oil. Who's got some heating oil for the Atlanta school system, which is a shortage of heating oil. And said he's been gone about 2 hours, and I haven't heard from him. And I said, And then about that time, we got a call from a television station that the man had called there. The colonel in the American Revolutionary Army. And so anyway, at that time I called Tarver. Tarver says, call the FBI. I did. And the FBI swarmed down to the newspaper, put a recorder on my phone and everything. And they had guns on and so forth. And we had a news editor named Glenn McCutcheon. And so one of the FBI agents walked over to the news editor and said, we need a picture of Mr. Murphy to send out on our the missing, wherever they send him. He said, where can I get a picture of Mr. Murphy? Well, we probably got a file of him down the reference room. But our news editor says, well, there are a lot of them on his wall in there, in his office. We'll go in there and get one of those. So anyway, the special agent goes in there, and there's a picture, in a framed glass picture with Murphy and Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon has got his arm draped around Murphy and says, to my good friend, Reg Murphy, Lyndon Johnson. So the special agent takes his shoe, cracks that glass with the heel, takes his pocket knife and cut Reg's face out of the picture. Reg blamed it on me. He never forgave me. And that was Reg's great picture with Lyndon Johnson. But anyway, so there are a lot of telephone calls back and forth. And when the guy rode Reg around for about 2 nights, 3 days. And also the calls to discuss ransom and so forth and everything. And finally it comes down to a call relayed through a little girl, a high school girl who was working part-time in a lawyer's office, that the instructions that were to how the ransom was to be delivered, $700,000, which also insulted Murphy. He thought he was at least worth $1 million. And but anyway, in the meantime, the instruction was to deliver it up here on 400, and 400 was desolate countryside then, where be drive an open Jeep, and to wear tennis shoes and a short sleeve shirt. And I don't know why that was necessary, but it did. And have no bugs and no surveillance. If that happened, then Murphy and I both would be eliminated. And so, of course, I was elected had to drive the Jeep, which was disappointing to me because I'd been going over to this FBI building. They had an automobile over there that I was to drive. And they went down there, and I was to drive that car, and they would have an FBI agent with a machine gun in the back. And we'd practice that. He had a compartment back there, so, but instead I had to go it alone. And it was a sort of cold, rainy day. But anyway, drove it up there and saw the man, got to the place where we were going to drop the money out, and had 2 suitcases. One had $500,000 and 20, the other one had 200,000. They got wedged in there, and I couldn't get the damn thing out. And so I thought, this is going to be embarrassing, In the meantime, Reg and the kidnapper waiting about down the road for me to get it out. And I'm trying to get that thing tugged out from under the seat, and I finally got it out. And anyway, and just as I was about to get it out, this airplane comes down the middle of the median, flying down the road, obviously looking over the situation. The guy threatened to kill us. And then I looked over across the road, and there's a guy out there, an old farmer, trying to catch a horse. He had a bridle chasing around there. And of course, the next day there was no farmer, no bridle, and there was a cab. There was an old farmer broken down out there. We found out later we were covered by high-powered rifles. They were everywhere, So, but the FBI had already found out who the kidnapper was from a source in Miami, and they just followed the guy home and got all the money back except $20 that his wife had spent for groceries. And Terry Adamson, who became one of Griffin Bell's lieutenants in the Justice Department, was a law student at Emory who had worked some at the Constitution. He picked Murphy up and took Murphy home, and all came out. We all lived happily ever after. They only had a few problems. I remember Tarver walked in and told Tom Wood, who was then our business manager, said, "Tom, call out to Murphy's house and tell his wife that anything we can possibly do, we'll do it, and just let us know." So he called out there and came back in the room. And Tarver said, "Did she need anything?" Well, she said, "Yeah." I said there was a lot of family, and there were a lot of extra people there, and they were running out of toilet paper. Could we bring them some toilet paper? So we took care of that. And then I'd been up forever, and got no sleep and so forth. And they had a press conference after I got back with my Jeep ride, and Murphy had been recovered in the lobby of the Journal-Constitution building, and I had no idea and what was going on really down there. But Bill Fields comes and says, "You got to go down to be interviewed at this press conference." So I went down there, and the people were just full of folks. You know, I had no idea. It scared me, but anyway, Aubrey Morris comes up with his microphone and he says, "How did you feel heading out of town in an open Jeep and a short sleeve shirt and $700,000 in the car?" I said, "Well, Aubrey, felt sort of like Furman Bishop headed for spring training." Because, you know, he always got a convertible from somebody else and big expense account and left. But the happy ending of that story was that because of Patty Hearst being in captivity, Reg having been in captivity even for a short time, Patty's father and mother got in touch with Reg. You know, Randy Hearst worked here when Hearst owned the Georgian, and Patty's mother is from Atlanta. So they got to know Reg, talking about the kidnapping thing, you know, what she was going through and so forth. And since Reg didn't like me very well and had a great offer in San Francisco, he went to the San Francisco Examiner to be editor of Hearst's paper. He did a good job, and then got to be publisher. And then Hearst made him publish the Baltimore papers. That's when newspapers were worth a lot. And Hearst sold the Baltimore paper to the Los Angeles Times company. And the Wall Street Journal had a story that said that Murphy's share of stock was $14.5 million. So I sent him a wire. I said, "Next time you get your behind kidnapped, don't call me, write a check." But Murphy and I patched that all up, and I say I admire him very much. He's had a great career, and I just wish that we had I wish he'd stayed in Atlanta.
So you retired from the newspapers, but you're still very active in journalism.
No.
You stopped writing your...
I don't write anything except checks. No, I am wrote out.
You wrote out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember you telling me one time about, I think it was you, that when you became a journalist and working for the newspapers, that you told your mother that since you turned pro, you didn't write home free.
No, I've never, writing has never been real easy for me. I'm happy enough not to write. I never considered myself a writer. I just was, I don't know. I really enjoyed the editing part of newspapering more than I did writing.
But you established a lot of friends. You were good friends with Senator Talmadge, for example.
Yeah, he was, Herman may be the smartest man I've ever known, but he's amazing and didn't hold grudges. You know, he had a great line of his says, he told me that he never really got angry with anybody at the Journal Constitution except Bill Shipp and Hal Gulliver, and he had reason to. But he said, well, if all I knew about myself was what I read in the Atlanta Constitution, I'd have voted against myself. I don't know whether, I guess y'all can cut these things if you want to, but have you heard that story about our reporter who asked Herman what he really thought of Zell Miller? Asked him when he would know they had that nasty campaign when Zell ran against him. He said, well, Senator, what do you really think of Zell Miller? Well, I knew his daddy. He too was a son of a bitch. But like I say, I used to go and eat breakfast with Herman, and when we were both out of office, and he cooked breakfast. And went over there one morning. He's sitting there in his coveralls with his spitting over here and chewing tobacco, reading Carl Sanders' book that Carl had written. I'd read the book. I said, well, Sanders, what do you think of Carl's book? He said, in his book, Carl comes out well ahead of Thomas Jefferson. But Herman was quite a character. He was, but he would talk nice about Zell and about what a great thing Zell had done with the Hope Scholarship. He'd talk nice about I've forgotten who was going to talk nice about, but Carter, about Carter with these homes he's building and so forth and everything. And I asked him one day, I said, son, I said, of all the people you served in the United States Senate, I said, who were the ones you really admired and respected? He thought for a minute. I said, I'd have to put Ted Kennedy near the top of that list. He said, he did his homework. He was a good son. I'd have to put him near the top of that list. I told Rogers Wade about that. Rogers said, I don't believe he said that. But Herman was different. I said, well, what do you consider your greatest accomplishment? He said, I'd have to say that one of my greatest accomplishments was the establishment of the Georgia Forestry Commission. And he ticked off when he started it and how much it had grown and so forth and everything. And of course he had his own forest, and we'd go out and we'd eat breakfast, and we'd go out and feed his bird dogs, and we'd get in his old beat up pickup truck, and we'd go out there and cruise his timber. Now he'd say, when I planted these pines back in 1948, I thought they might be useful at some time, and said, now they are. But he sold a bunch of timber, and we'd go out, and he knew how we would look at the top of the tree and take so many steps out and look, and then we'd measure how tall the tree was by where we would stand in, and then we would count the trees in a circle, and he'd figure up how much money he had. He had a lot, but he was very, very, I just liked him a lot.
You also have served on the Board of Trustees at Young Harris College with Zell Miller.
Yeah. Well, Zell and Lewis and Lee Walburn and I used to go to the country music thing in Nashville, and I remember coming back after, I guess it ran against Herman. We were driving back, and Zell said he was going home, getting out of politics. He was fed up. He was going to get out and go teach at Young Harris, and was not going to be in politics anymore. That didn't work out. But one time we went up there, and Zell had a speech in Kentucky or somewhere, so he flew back there and was going to ride back to Atlanta. And got back to the building in Atlanta. He had his bag in my car, and we pulled up on the side of the building, took his bag out. I did, put it on the sidewalk. Zell hopped out and got in his drive and left for the Capitol. About 30 minutes later, I was in my office to clean up my desk. My secretary says, they want you downstairs in the lobby. Said, there's a bomb in the lobby. And I said, there's a bomb in the lobby. Well, they were disturbed because Colonel Ortega from Nicaragua had been visiting with Andy Young, had come by, so They thought that was why the bomb got down there. And I got down there in the lobby, and there was a suitcase sitting in the middle of the lobby, and they had everybody backed up, and our chief of security had a stethoscope that he got down to medical care, and he was listening in the bag. I mean, what idiots. And the bomb squad was on the way, and the bomb squad got there, and they were about to open the suitcase. I said, don't do that. That's a Lieutenant Governor's suitcase. We'll see his dirty underwear. And they didn't take my word for it. But about that time, Zell's driver drove back up and got his suitcase. But it caused a big commotion. But we had great trips on that. But one time I was sitting in my office, which was sort of down at the end of the hall, and there got to be a loud noise shouting out in the newsroom. My secretary comes in and she said, "Something's going on out in the newsroom, you better go out there." And Bill Shipp had a little glass office off to the side. Zell was Lieutenant Governor. And I got out there, and Shipp was sitting in his office, not saying a word also. And Zell was out there, had his fist up, red in the face. And when Zell gets mad, he reverts to his mountain twang, And Zell was shouting, "Come on out, come on out. I'll whoop your ass, I'll whoop your ass." And I got so tickled I was doubled over laughing. And anyway, they got him quieted down, and I guess they probably went off and had a drink together. But they fought one day and were friends the next.
Love-hate relationship.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Jim, looking back over, what do you think is your greatest accomplishment?
I'd say my greatest accomplishment, what I'm most proud of, I thought I brought, I really thought with some help from Bill Fields and a lot of good folks, I was lucky to have a great staff at the Constitution. I thought that I had a big hand in making the Constitution a lot better newspaper than it had been. And the one thing I guess I'm really proud of, when I got to the Constitution, Bob, I found out that those folks wasn't making any money at all because they had that little in-house union. As the executive sports editor of the Journal, I was making considerably more than the news editors and the key people on the Constitution people. And so I just went down and asked for more money, and I got it. And I often wondered why McGill and Patterson, with their prestige, didn't do the same, because the newsroom payroll is not the big expense of a newspaper. It's newsprint and a lot of other things. But I was pretty successful in raising the payroll of the Atlanta Constitution, and therefore raising the quality of the newspaper. And I guess that's what privately I'm most proud of.
You have a son in the newspaper business.
Sort of. They cut back, he was covering NASCAR, so now they're not covering NASCAR anymore. They do cover the Atlanta race, but for example, this past weekend, they think it's better to cover the road Atlanta than Talladega. Now, you know a little about readership. You know a little about people. Who you think's going to read the most? Does Road Atlanta have the most readers, or Talladega?
Oh, Pat Talladega by a big margin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he actually is a contract writer now. They're not covering really anything like that out of state, except maybe the Falcons and pro football teams.
Well, he must have the mentor genes. He's a very good writer.
Well, thank you. I'll pass that on to him. He'll be pleased to hear that.
Please do.
Yeah.
Jim Minter, thank you very much for being our guest. We could sit here and talk forever, but we've enjoyed it, and Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'd like to interview you. You've had a great career and somewhat varied, I would say.